All right, it's time to resurrect Ghost, everyone. It's time to resurrect Ghost. Lord knows I have killed him in enough theory videos. Kind of getting a bad reputation for that. And I love animals. I love all animals. You know me, I'm the bird man. Goose dance? You gonna dance? So I'm happy to straighten this out today. Ghost is gonna get resurrected. It's gonna be a fire white wolf. From direwolf to firewolf. Again, the white wolf. Named Ghost. It's right there. It's right there. And actually, fiery hellhound zombie ghost, if you will, was originally something I threw out as a hypothetical at the end of an old series called Melisandre's Secrets, which consisted of 4 tightly produced videos and ended in a 2-hour live stream full of what-ifs and speculation. But after reviewing the evidence about fire white ghost while writing and researching last week's Melisandre's Fate video, thanks for watching, I now believe that this will in fact happen. So if everyone would kindly associate me with the idea of resurrecting Ghost instead of sacrificing Ghost, that'd be great. And I also got this new adjustable height standing desk from our newest sponsor, FlexiSpot, so stay tuned for the YouTuber tries to assemble furniture challenge. Now, Jon is dead these past 14 years. No, it's not been 14 years, it's been a few hours in real time, and probably it will end up being about 3 days. You know, like that guy, this guy, you know him. And most people expect that Jon will be resurrected by Melisandre or with Melisandre's help, just like on the show, or not exactly like that, because we're expecting more pyrotechnics and a little less beauty salon, and maybe with a dash of Bran and Bloodraven thrown in. And of course, I think there's a lot of symbolism and foreshadowing that indicates that the others will steal Jon's corpse, at least for a time, presumably long enough to cross the wall. But whether or not that happens, at some point, Melisandre surely will give Jon the last kiss and breathe the R'hllorist resurrection fire down into his cold, dead lungs. And I think overall it's easy to see that Mel's entire plot is basically leading up to resurrecting Jon. And that, of course, was the subject of last week's very long video. Again, thanks for watching. And as we saw in that video, the foreshadowing that Ghost will need to be sacrificed in order to resurrect Jon is extensive. But I also began to point out that all these scenes that seem to foreshadow Ghost's death also seem to have clues about Ghost's resurrection, that he will be fire-whited along with Jon. The scene with Mel and Jon and Ghost at the wall was heavy laden with this idea, and so were all the Drogo scenes that seem to foreshadow Jon's resurrection. We'll revisit both of those scenes today, as well as several new ones which also seem to point to a Ghost resurrection. So again, after bumming many people out for many years by stubbornly pointing out the Mithras white bull Ghost is going to get sacrificed to resurrect Jon's symbolism, I'm here to atone and explain how Ghost will become the ultimate incarnation of the stark direwolf hellhound archetype. So friends, if you like YouTube videos made by humans with human art and no AI whatsoever, then go ahead and you know what to do. Click the thumbs up button, leave a comment after watching, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because friends, I do this every week. And when I'm hard at work every week writing, producing, editing YouTube videos with my own 2 hands, I'm never ever sitting down at a desk because sitting down to work sucks. Sitting down is fine for watching House of the Dragon with your friends and loved ones, or for having chill conversations about mythology, but sitting down to work? No thank you. And this is the E7 adjustable height standing desk from FlexiSpot, which was quite easy to assemble, by the way. And look, you guys and anyone else who knows me has heard me preach the virtues of the standing desk for years, so you know how excited I am about this sponsor. I couldn't even let Rhaegar do this one. And yes, I know reading Rhaegar is just a figment of my imagination, but don't let him hear you say that. And by back pain, I mean that familiar feeling of a harpy eagle perching in between your shoulder blades that develops after crouching and sitting at a desk day after day. Humans aren't really evolved for sitting for long periods of time, and sure enough, switching to a standing desk has made my life much better, which is why the number of YouTube videos that I have edited sitting down is literally 0. Now, I do like to sit down to record, of course. It's just a little more of a chill vibe. And since this is an adjustable height standing desk, it's very easy to rapidly go from sitting to standing position at the touch of a button. The E7 is super solid, and I'll just let you see what the legs look like here. It's real nice metal design. Very cool. And again, solid, not gonna wobble to and fro from the fury of your typing or whatever. And this is the new and popular bamboo finish, which I thought was a nice match for the studio. They have, of course, a bunch of other cool finishes too, and other options to choose from over at flexispot.com, which is where you can find all their standing desks as well as all kinds of ergonomic chairs. And make sure you check out the sales event page. You'll want to catch the 80% off Black Friday sale while that's going. That's their best sale of the year. And then on top of that, you can get an extra $30 off by using code Lightbringer at checkout and leaving a note with our channel name in it. So guys, Guys, you've been hearing me talk about this for years, like I said. The relief of back pain, the kinetic energy, the ability to dance and work at the same time, the movement that spurs blood flow and extra creativity. If you've been thinking about getting a standing desk, this is the time. This is a great desk to get. And because it's adjustable, there's no fear of commitment issues. You can still sit if you want to. And they have a 30-day satisfaction guarantee. So check out flexispot.com, use promo code Lightbringer, and quit the sit. All right, first topic, 3 heads. 3 heads has the dragon, 3 heads has the hellhound. Because the very first clue that the final form for Ghost the direwolf will be firewolf is the idea that the Stark direwolf is inspired by Cerberus, the 3-headed Greek hellhound. Well, he's from Greek mythology. He himself is not Greek. Cerberus, or Kerberos, is actually just the Greek version of a much older and more widespread mytheme, that of the dog that guards the entrance to the underworld, usually a river crossing. That idea is actually so old it was present in the ancestors of the Native Americans before they split off from the ancestors of everyone else in Europe and Asia. So it's a story that's pretty much found everywhere. And it does seem that dogs were probably first domesticated by very ancient Siberian hunter-gatherers, so that's probably where the story starts. But in any case, Cerberus the hellhound both guards the entrance to Hades as well as keeping the people that are imprisoned in Hades. Maybe that's why he needs 3 heads so he can watch in all directions. And even though Cerberus is most famous for having 3 heads, Cerberus also has a serpent's tail and a mane full of snakes. And then on top of that, lion's claws. So it's basically a Greek chimera. The Greeks loved chimeras. And it's a very draconic or serpentine chimera. If you like to say chimera, then I'm sorry. Point is, the sigils of House Targaryen and House Stark are both essentially Cerberus flags. So essentially, George took a 3-headed draconic hellhound and split it in half. He split it into a 3-headed dragon and a 1-headed hellhound. And as you can see, Jon is very proud that his direwolf is a representative of the sigil of his father's house, House Stark. And of course, a fire white ghost would kind of be the ultimate version of a Stark hellhound. So what is George doing here? Why did George do this? Well, it seems like he wanted both House Stark and Targaryen to have this sort of underworld hellish symbolism. And I'm talking, of course, primarily about the crypts of Winterfell, around which Winterfell is built, as well as Dragonstone, where the Targaryens are from, and the subterranean chambers under the Red Keep in King's Landing. That's the place where Arya goes, where all the dragon skulls are. So interestingly, Winterfell and Dragonstone are the only 2 castles in the main series that have gargoyles. And while the gargoyles at Winterfell are too rain-worn to identify their shape, the ones described at Dragonstone take the form of dragons, wyverns, and hellhounds. And in a few minutes, we'll get to a scene where Ghost is acting like a gargoyle hellhound at the Fist of the First Men. But sticking with the Winterfell-Dragonstone comparison, they are both geothermal hotspots, with a lot of caverns, obviously. Winterfell isn't a volcano, but it does have all the hot springs. And the World of Ice and Fire compares the hot springs to Dragonstone directly. And the common folk of Winterfell and the Wintertown, they of course say that, the hot springs are heated by a dragon that sleeps down there. So once again, you can see George drawing similarities between Dragonstone and Winterfell. And that's because they are his 2 most important archetypal hellish underworld locations for these houses that have Cerberus flags for sigils. And then I also mentioned the Red Keep, which has the dragon skull chambers below that Arya wanders around in. They too seem constructed as a parallel to the Winterfell crypts. So first of all, the Winterfell crypts are accessed with a spiral staircase that goes down, and Arya goes from the room with the dragon skulls to a big well, with Varys and Illyrio first coming up the spiral steps of the well and then Arya going down. The most important and easy to pick up on comparison would be the dead but following you eyes of the Kings of Winter statues and the empty eye sockets of the dragon skulls, which similarly always seem to follow you when you're walking by. Martin uses this language basically anytime someone goes down into the Winterfell crypts or anytime someone sees the dragon skulls under the Red Keep. And then there's also the chapter where Sansa goes under the Red Keep and sees the Targaryen suits of armor. They too have empty eye sockets that seem to follow you. So basically, these are the halls of the dead. The halls of the dead Kings of Winter, the halls of the dead Targaryen dynasty, their old suits of armor and dragon skulls, with no Targaryens, sadly, to get in the armor or ride the dragon. Which don't exist. Or at least they didn't, until Dany brought him back. Now, the reason that I first thought to compare the crypts of Winterfell to the subterranean chambers of the Red Keep is that Arya does it herself. That's why. Arya essentially banishes her fear of the subterranean Red Keep chambers by comparing them to the crypts of Winterfell, of which she is not afraid. And while Arya is reminiscing on the Winterfell crypts, there is a very clear reference to Jon's resurrection, a classic. Jon has essentially powdered himself up with flour to look like a white ghost, and then he pops out of the sepulchre moaning for blood. And I would call that not only Jon resurrection symbolism, but Jon's body will get stolen and wighted by the other symbolism. But it's definitely something about Jon coming back from the dead, and when he does, he might get to ride one of those living dragons, and maybe they'll even, rustle up the suits of armor. And now that I think about it, why wouldn't there be a dragon saddle somewhere down there if they kept the suits of armor? Anyway, I digress. All right, so continuing with the same topic, but making a new section. This one's called Hellhounds. Let's talk about the scene where Shaggy and Summer mimic the Hellhounds of the story of Simeon Stareyes down in the Winterfell crypts. So first of all, Simeon Stareyes famously went to the wall to the Night Fort to watch the Hellhounds fight. And then in that scene where Bran and Osha and Summer and Maester Luwin go down into the Winterfell crypts to show them that Ned is not down there. That was only a dream. Shaggy Dog and Rickon are hiding in the darkness of the sepulchre. And Shaggy leaps out of the darkness of the sepulchre very dramatically and has a little tussle with Summer. So here's the quote on the screen. And as you can see, first, Summer is a leaping shadow. He slams in a Shaggy Dog. And then it says, in the light of the guttering torch, shadow wolves 20 feet tall fought on the wall and roof. So, Simeon Stareyes went to the wall to watch the Hellhounds fight, and here we've got shadow wolves fighting on the wall, down in the crypts, where Hellhounds live. And of course, the Night Fort, where the Hellhounds fought, that is similarly an underworld location like the crypts. One associated with Starks, of course, and in fact, this whole story about Hellhounds fighting at the Night Fort, well, it probably refers to, and check out my Night Fort videos, the idea of the Night's King, who was supposedly a Stark, getting thrown down by the King of Winter, who was obviously a Stark. So those are two Starks fighting at the Night Fort, could easily be mythologized as two Hellhounds fighting. And Simeon Stareyes has blue star eyes, so something otherish is going on there. And then going back to just the basics of what's happening in this scene, there's a Stark and a direwolf leaping out of the sepulchre. So that would seem to also be talking about a Stark resurrection, or a Stark and Stark direwolf resurrection. And pretty much everything in this chapter and in the Winterfell crypts is getting back to Jon's resurrection somehow. Such as the scene where they hide down in the crypts and then come out and make enough noise to wake a dragon. While Summer the direwolf sees a serpent that is a river of flame that sounds like a dragon, but which is probably just a gust of flame, you guys. We'll come back to this in a second, but yeah, pretty much anything about Kings of Winter being resurrected, it's talking about Jon. Now, we can't talk about Hellhounds without mentioning Sandor Clegane, at least for a moment, because Sandor of House Clegane, with their sigil of 3 black dogs on yellow, so not one 3-headed dog, but 3 dogs, with the yellow being like the flames of hell. And of course, Sandor himself is burned and hellish, and he's also a guard dog, literally called Joffrey's dog, and he's a guard who keeps Joffrey's prisoners in line, as well as guarding Joffrey. However, he famously quits that job and then gets a new job, which is protecting Starks. That's basically all he does. He protects Sansa and then he protects Arya. So he's effectively Sansa and then Arya's new direwolf. Sansa loses her direwolf on the way to King's Landing, and then it's largely Sandor who protects her in King's Landing. Sandor and Tyrion, I guess, but yeah. And then of course Arya drove off Nymeria before wandering around in the Riverlands. And while that relationship is complicated, you see what I mean. All Sandor the Hellhound does is protect Starks. So he's like their replacement direwolf, and Arya even says to Sandor, "You go to hell, hound," because he's a hellhound, and this even happens in a very obvious underworld location, which is Beric's Weirwood Cave next to a giant bonfire. The hound is fighting a duel in the underworld versus a zombie, but of course he wins. Because he's Cerberus, this is his place. And actually the idea of Sandor the Hellhound fighting Beric, a burning wight, is a third occurrence of the pattern that we saw in last week's video of some kind of shadow wolf or hellhound fighting against a burning wight, which is showing us the two halves of Jon that need to be zipped back up. A fire wight and the spirit of a wolf. And you'll have to go back to that video for the full explanation. We did a whole section on it. But outside of Bloodraven's cave, we had Summer the wolf fighting against a burning wight, and in Mirri Maz Duur's Tent of Dancing Shadows, where she was doing her thing with Drogo, we saw the shadow of a wolf and a man wreathed in flame. So yes, Hellhound Sandor and Firewhite Beric, it's just one more version of Jon resurrection foreshadowing, and obviously Beric himself foreshadows Jon. So to sum up, Hellhounds belong to hot, hellish underworlds. Places like the Winterfell Crypts, or Dragonstone, or the Red Keep subterranean chambers with the dragon skulls, or even Barrack's Weirwood Cave. And the important thing that I want to drive home is that George bases all of these hellish underworld locations on Cerberus and Hades. And in particular, everything in the Winterfell Crypts, both the King of Winter stuff and the dragon warming the crypts or hatching from the crypts, that's all about Jon's resurrection, because he's going to be a King of Winter, which, as we know, is based on folklore about a burning green man, just similar to a fire wight. And Jon will probably be realizing that he's a Targaryen upon resurrecting as well. And as we know from Dunk and Egg from the Mystery Knight, a Targaryen throwing off a fake identity and coming into their own as a Targaryen can be perceived in dreams as a dragon hatching. So Jon's resurrection will be like a dragon hatching. It will be like a King of Winter coming back to life. And all of this stuff is emanating from the Winterfell Crypts, the home of Cerberus. So just as Cerberus is the only one that can grant entrance or an exit from Hades, Ghost, the direwolf hellhound, will be the one who mediates Jon's return from death. Just as Mithras, the white bull, enables Mithras to return from death. And just as Mithras's white bull is thought to be not only a friend to Mithras, but a part of Mithras or an avatar of Mithras, Ghost was closer than a friend. Ghost was part of him. All right, let's talk about Eyes of Fire, which is what the direwolves have. That's right, even if you had never heard the name Cerberus, somehow, you could still read the books of A Song of Ice and Fire and realize that the direwolves are firewolves. You simply have to look into their eyes, their burning, infernal, hellish, balefire-full eyes. You get it. Baleful, that's the word I was looking for. In any case, first wolf, Summer. I'll put the quotes up on the screen here. He was made of silver and smoke with eyes of yellow gold. The wolf glanced up from time to time, eyes smoldering like liquid gold. He stalked forward, all teeth and hot eyes. His muzzle was wet and red, but his eyes burned. Its eyes glowed golden in the dark room. And speaking of golden eyes, that's right, we're doing props. And in fact, we're going on a bit of an adventure here, folks. I've got a lot of colored sunglasses. Anyway, speaking of golden eyes, as I go through these quotes, I'm also going to give you some descriptions of other creatures or humanoids which have similar language to the eyes of the direwolves. So the children of the forest that Bran sees in the cave, their eyes are large and liquid, gold and green. So there's that liquid gold description. And then Missandei, who is from Nath, with the Nathi potentially being related to the children of the forest. She also has eyes like molten gold. Grey Wind has some of the best stuff. It says, Grey Wind edged forward, tail stiff, watching through slitted eyes of dark gold. And then my favorite one, lean and smoke dark, with eyes like molten gold. I love this one because it compares well to the description of Ned's ice that we get at the very beginning of Game of Thrones. The blade was Valyrian steel, spell forged and dark as smoke. And then, of course, Ned's ice is covered in molten gold when it's turned into Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper. So Grey Wind, basically the language of a forge. Molten gold and dark smoke. And best of all, this description, lean and smoke dark with eyes of molten gold, this comes when Robb is sitting enthroned in Riverrun as King in the North. But he's sitting in the traditional King of Winter statue pose with the sword across his lap and the direwolf at his side. And he's demanding the return of ice, which is spell-forged and dark as smoke. So both ice and Grey Wind, weapons of the King of the North or the King of Winter, and they get similar descriptions. With the larger point being that the descriptive language George chose for Grey Wind evokes Valyrian steel and the smoke that comes from smelting metals and stuff like that. And in fact, two of Dany's three dragons, Rhaegal and Viserion, also are caught with eyes of molten gold, as you can see on the screen, with Viserion in particular having just tons of quotes about this. I just chose one. It's got pools of molten gold, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, in George's mind, the eyes of the dragons and the eyes of some of these direwolves basically look the same. And that's because they are both the eyes of Cerberus, staring at you with the balefire of Hades reflecting in its irises, or however you want to say it. And then we get Shaggy Dog, good old Shaggy Dog, where George turns the infernal descriptions up to 666. So as you can see, his eyes were green fire, his eyes burning like green fire. Shaggy Dog had come slobbering out of the darkness like a green-eyed demon. So this is almost worse than Cerberus. And in fact, check out the description of the black goat of Qohor, a shaggy black goat the size of an oryx. A shaggy black goat, everyone. A demonic shaggy black goat. And of course, Shaggy Dog goes to Skagos with Rickon, and the one thing we know about their time there is that Shaggy Dog is fighting one of those enormous unicorn goats. And then the other descriptive comp to Shaggy Dog is the cannibal, the dragon the cannibal, who is described as being coal black with baleful green eyes. And just as Shaggy and Rickon run into enormous goats on Skagos. Skagos is also the island of cannibals, supposedly. Could be hearsay, but yeah, it's interesting that George uses the same language to describe Shaggy and the cannibal, and then Shaggy goes to an island of cannibals. But whatever you make of that, and let me know in the comments, because that's been perplexing me for a while. The point is, the eyes of all these direwolves are similar to dragons and demons and things like that. Then we've got Nymeria and Lady, who both have golden eyes. Nymeria's eyes gleamed like 2 golden coins, and in this other one, the she-wolf regarded him silently with her dark golden eyes. And then there's Lady with her bright golden eyes, and rest in peace, Lady. She only gets that one description, gone before her time. And then finally we come to Ghost, who has red eyes, which are compared to a lot of things, but mainly fire and blood and red stars. That all makes sense. Fire and blood evokes House Targaryen, Jon's hidden identity. And you could say his fire and blood identity is hidden under the name Snow, just as Ghost's eyes of fire and blood peek out from a white coat that is white as snow. And then, of course, red stars, Azor High Reborn, Jon is Azor High Reborn. And one of the main points of last week's video is that Jon will become Azor High Reborn when he is reborn through his wolf Ghost, who has eyes like red stars. So here are the fire-eyed Ghost quotes. When the direwolf raised his head, his eyes glowed red and baleful, and water streamed down from his jaws like slaver. There was something fierce and terrible about him in that instant. And then there's a line about those hot red eyes, about how the direwolf's eyes burned red as embers, another one with eyes like embers, and of course Melisandre says that Azor Ahai will be reborn like an ember from the ashes. So that's interesting. And then we've got his eyes glowing red in the moonlight, and that's when they're not glowing like red pools of fire in the moonlight. And then finally his eyes caught the last light and shone like 2 great red suns. And technically red suns are red stars, obviously, but if we're talking about a physical description, a red sun looks different than a red star. But you get the point. They're very fiery, baleful red eyes, except when they're bloody red eyes. So the famous quote is where Jon is comparing them to Melisandre's red eyes. And he thinks, red eyes, but not like Melisandre's. He had a weirwood's eyes, red mouth, white fur, blood and bone, like a heart tree. He belongs to the old gods, this one. And then a complimentary quote, white fur and red eyes, Jon realized, disquieted, like the trees. So this is a really fun one. In the moment this is happening, Jon is experiencing this crisis, an identity crisis, because Stannis has proposed to give him Winterfell and make him Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, with Valis his wife, by the way. But he's got to let Melisandre rip up the heart tree and burn it. And so he looks at Ghost and he's like, oh yeah, no, the old gods, that's where I'm from, that's my culture, I can't do that. And so he's like, oh yeah, his eyes are not red like Melisandre's. However, in a different quote, they're exactly like Melisandre's, which we're about to read that, so. And at the end of the day, this whole resurrection bonfire for Jon, it's going to bring together the elements of the old gods and the demonic fire god. Not only will Ghost be burned on the pyre by Melisandre the Valorist, but one imagines there very well may be weirwood in the pyre, just as weirwood was used in Mance Rayder's cage that was burned at the wall. Well, Lord of Bones glamored as Mance Rayder. Anyway, so then we've got this quote at the fist of the first men. Atop the stones of the ring wall, Ghost hunched with white fur bristling. He made no sound, but his dark red eyes spoke blood. So what's cool about this is that Ghost is hanging out at the fist of the first men, which is obviously a place of the first men, and he's got the blood red eyes of the weirwood. However, he's basically acting like a gargoyle here. He's perched atop the stones of the ring wall, just like a gargoyle perches atop the wall of a castle or cathedral. And gargoyles, of course, bring us back to the hellhound, wyvern, dragon symbolism. So this quote is a nice sort of tying together of concepts. And then we have the weird, contradictory Melisandre and Ghost both have red star eyes quote. And also my red Bootsy Collins star glasses that I've been waiting to get to. So, as you can see, her eyes were 2 red stars shining in the dark. At her throat, the ruby gleamed, a third eye glowing brighter than the others. So that's cool because the shining in the dark language evokes the Night's Watch, and glowing brighter than the others evokes the Night's Watch battling the others, and obviously the red star is the comet that signals Azor Ahai's return. So then it says Jon had seen Ghost's eyes blazing red the same way when they caught the light just right. So it's literally Jon contradicting himself. It's Jon himself saying, oh yeah, Ghost's eyes look red like Melisandre's, but only when they catch the light, meaning when they're in a fire together. When Ghost catches the Lord of Lights, red fire, his red star fire, you guys. And so, to sum up what we've learned this section, basically all the descriptions of the eyes of the direwolves, and even the smoky fur of a few of them, seem intended to evoke the infernal Hades underworld from which Cerberus comes. And in particular, the descriptions of the eyes of the direwolves very closely match the descriptions of the eyes of Dany's dragons. Speaking of which, we forgot about Drogon. Let me pull the Drogon quote real quick. We actually don't get a description of Drogon's eyes until Dany is staring him full in the face in Daznak's pit. And then it says, his eyes were molten, and in the smoldering red pits of Drogon's eyes, Dany saw her own reflection. So there you go, molten red pits of fire. And in case you haven't noticed, Jon and Dany with their animals have the same inverted coloring. So Jon is all in black with black hair, and his animal is white with red eyes. And then Dany is all in white and silver with silver hair and pale coloring, and she has a black dragon with red eyes. So there you go, dragons and direwolves. They're both fashioned from Cerberus, and they both stare at you with, again, the infernal balefire of hell. But not necessarily Christian hell, because Hades is different. It's like an underworld place, but you get the point. So that's all cool. The direwolves, they're fiery, they're like Cerberus, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Ghost is going to get wighted, does it? Well, we have seen zombie wolves before, 3 of them actually, in 2 different dreams, or nightmares, I guess you'd say, of one Theon Greyjoy, who has the bad luck, or maybe the bad notion, to, steal Winterfell from the Starks. So his reward for that are these cool nightmares about direwolves, and, well, let's just read them. The sky was a gloom of cloud, the woods dead and frozen. Roots grabbed at Theon's feet as he ran, and bare branches lashed his face, leaving thin stripes of blood across his cheeks. He crashed through, heedless, breathless, icicles flying to pieces before him. "Mercy," he sobbed. From behind came a shuddering howl that curdled his blood. "Mercy! Mercy!" When he glanced back over his shoulder, he saw them coming. Great wolves the size of horses, with the heads of small children. "Oh, mercy! Mercy!" Blood dripped from their mouths black as pitch, burning holes in the snow where it fell. Every stride brought them closer. Theon tried to run faster, but his legs would not obey. The trees all had faces, and they were laughing at him. Laughing, and the howl came again. He could smell the hot breath of the beasts behind him, a stink of brimstone and corruption. So first of all, the infernal language of the brimstone stink. The blood itself is burning, just like a dragon's blood, or perhaps the blood of a fire wight. And the blood is also black, just like the wights of ice and fire. And there's the corruption stink that we also smell with the wights. The wolves themselves have the heads of Bran and Rickon on them, or perhaps a composite of the 2 Miller's sons that Theon killed in place of Bran and Rickon. But the point is they are wolves with human heads on them. So it's some sort of zombified combination of human and wolf. Also of note, this is one of the only times we see the weirwood talking per se. It's laughing at Theon, and this is just a dream, and similarly, we're all waiting for a weirwood-colored ghost to make his first noise. So that's Theon's first nightmare, and a potential foreshadowing of zombie Stark direwolves. And then we have Theon's nightmare of Robb and Grey Wind. Robb, who he backstabbed just like a bitch. But there were others with faces he had never known in life, faces he had seen only in stone. The slim, sad girl who wore a crown of pale blue roses and a white gown spattered with gore could only be Lyanna. Her brother Brandon stood beside her, and their father Lord Rickard just behind. Along the walls, figures half seen moved through the shadows, pale shades with long, grim faces. The sight of them sent fear shivering through Theon, sharp as a knife. And then the tall doors opened with a crash, and a freezing gale blew down the hall, and Robb came walking out of the night. Grey Wind stalked beside, eyes burning, and man and wolf alike bled from 100 savage wounds. So right after mention of Jon's mom, Lyanna, and the other major players of that era, we get very clear foreshadowing for Jon. This is a zombie king of winter and his zombie wolf coming back to Winterfell to retake it from pale shades and stuff. You'll notice the wolf's eyes burning, so think fire white ghost wolf here. And Robb has multiple stab wounds, just like Jon does. And the idea of Jon retaking Winterfell, that I think is foreshadowed, not only in this passage, but many others. And that's something I went into more detail in these videos here next to me. But basically, Jon died planning to go retake Winterfell from Ramsay Bolton. And although the circumstances might be different by the time he gets around to doing it, I do think some version of Zombie Jon, maybe Ice Zombie Jon with the others, or maybe Fire Zombie Jon, will be marching to Winterfell at some point and blowing the doors open and stalking in, eyes burning, etc., etc. Now, speaking of Robb, basically everything Robb is foreshadowing for Jon, in my opinion. For example, Robb's death at the Twins was similar to Jon's. It was a mutiny and a murder by his own man or men. Jon was murdered by his sworn brothers in the Watch, and Robb was murdered by his sworn vassals, Roose Bolton and Walder Frey, amongst others. Robb died first, and then Grey Wind out in the yard, which means that Robb probably died twice. Actually, he had a very short second life, and then that was cut off. But this will actually be the sequence with Jon. Jon died first, then Ghost will be sacrificed on the pyre. But then, of course, I'm predicting that Jon and Ghost will rise from the pyre. And we see that foreshadowed by the cruel mockery that the Freys made of Robb and Grey Wind's corpse. And of course, you'll remember they sewed the direwolf's head onto the human body. So it's kind of the opposite of Theon's first nightmare, where the human heads are on the direwolf bodies. And so here at the Twins, we again have what looks like a zombie resurrected wolfman, who is also a king of winter. Here it's a merged wolfman, but remember, in Theon's dreams, they were separate. And basically what I think is going to happen with Jon and Ghost is that the consciousness will actually be merged, but it will live in both bodies simultaneously. So that's going to be cool. If it happens, of course. Click thumbs up on the video. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. And at last we've come to Drogo's Pyre. Once again, I know. I made a whole 40-minute video about Drogo's Pyre just from the Dany Azor Ahai side of things. But it's also doing a lot of work foreshadowing Jon's resurrection, so we talked about this scene quite a bit in the Melisandre's Fate video, and one of the things that we noticed there is that it's not just Drogo who appears to rise from the pyre, but also the horse, because Drogo is riding a smoky stallion out of the pyre into the sky, and then up to the red comet, which becomes Drogo's celestial steed. His horse of fire, according to Dothraki belief. So, if this all is meant to foreshadow Jon's resurrection pyre, then maybe Jon and Ghost will rise from the pyre just as Drogo and the smoky stallion appear to. That's the basic idea, and I'll just put this quote up on the screen. We won't read it all dramatically, but the first thing I want to point out as we look at all the psychedelic visions that Dany has in the fire is that we see foreshadowing for the presence of Melisandre at Jon's pyre. They're sorcerers robed in yellow and orange and scarlet, swirling long smoky cloaks. That's literally the exact description of the priests of R'hllor in the Red Temple, basically word for word. And of course, I'm also talking about Mel playing the role of Dany, walking into the pyre, conducting the ritual. But it's pretty cool that George put a vision of a fire priestess or priest right in Dany's pyre. So then we get the crimson fire lions and the great yellow serpents and the unicorns made of pale blue flame. That's all very cool. Fish and foxes and monsters just to throw us off. Wolves and bright birds and flowering trees. And then she saw a horse, a great gray stallion, limbed in smoke, its flowing mane a nimbus of blue flame. She thinks, yes, my love, my sun and stars, yes, mount now, ride now. And then after Dany walks into the pyre, now she thought, now. And for an instant, she glimpsed Khal Drogo before her, mounted on his smoky stallion, a flaming lash in his hand. His whip snakes down at the pyre, hissing, and then the first egg cracks open, the platform of wood and brush begins to shift and collapse, and Dany is showered with ash and cinders. So what's going on here is that the smoky gray stallion, which is actually a column of smoke and ash, rising from a wooden platform, well, that's just a symbolic model of Yggdrasil, the Norse cosmic world tree. We're going to do the short version of this. We've covered this many times on the channel. Hopefully you all are familiar. But the Weirwoods are heavily based on the Norse world tree Yggdrasil, and Yggdrasil is a great ash tree. But the name Yggdrasil means Odin's horse, because Odin is hanged upon Yggdrasil. And in days of yore, they would call such gallows tree the horse of the hanged, because the hanged man is riding the gallows tree. Now, the Norse mythographers also connected this to the much older and deeper idea of a shaman riding an invisible horse into the other world. And basically, the ritual drumming that shamans would use during these trance sessions, they were perceived as the hoofbeats of this invisible horse that the shaman was riding. So we see that reflected twice in the mythology of Odin. Not only is his tree Yggdrasil a kind of horse that he uses to access the rune magic, which makes him the master of the cosmos, he's also got another horse, Sleipnir, and Sleipnir, literally its main power is that Odin can ride it into all the different 9 realms of the cosmos. So, getting back to Drogo's pyre, the column of smoke and ash. George is doing a bit of a symbolism pun here. Think of the ash tree like a column of ash, and of course, a tree looks like a mushroom cloud a bit. And so in this column of ash rising from Drogo's pyre, George has created the smoky gray stallion, and Sleipnir is a gray horse. And then just as Sleipnir conveys Odin through the cosmos, the smoky stallion is being ridden by Drogo up to the stars, up to the red comet, and into the realm of the dead. So it's very tight symbolism here. George has a very thorough understanding of Yggdrasil and the shamanic drumming, and the concept of the shaman's invisible horse. And it's all here at the pyre. And so the point is that both Jon and Drogo have an animal companion that is like a magic tree. Drogo's gray stallion of smoke and ash basically is a symbol of Yggdrasil, while Ghost, Jon's wolf, obviously looks like a weirwood, which is based on Yggdrasil. Just as Drogo's stallion transports him into the afterlife and facilitates a kind of rebirth, Ghost will transport Jon to and from death and facilitate his rebirth. You see how this goes. And as for Drogo's final starry celestial steed being the red comet, well, obviously that's a symbol of Azor High Reborn, and we've seen that Ghost's eyes blaze red like Melisandre's red star eyes when they catch the light just right. So if Ghost is fire whited, his eyes will really be red. I don't know if they can get burnier, but if they can, they will. But the main thing is that Drogo being reborn to ride the red comet is just really good foreshadowing for Jon and Ghost being reborn, red star eyes, fulfillments of the Azor High Reborn prophecy. And then on top of all of that, Ygritte actually compares Jon directly to a red star, not the red comet, but Mars the Red Wanderer. And of course, the red comet, also called a starry wanderer from far places. In any case, the wildlings call Mars the Red Wanderer the thief, while the Westerosi believe that it is sacred to the smith of the seven. But what Ygritte tells Jon is that when the thief is in the moon maid, meaning when Mars is in the constellation Virgo probably, that's when it's a good time to steal a wife, and that is when Jon stole Ygritte atop the Frostfang Pass, the Skirling Pass in the Frostfangs. So Jon is like the thief, stealing the moon maid, if you will, and right before Jon climbed up to Ygritte's campfire, they pointed at it and said, oh, that looks like a red star. So basically that's Jon's Azor High Nissa Nissa routine. And you'll notice he almost kills Ygritte, but doesn't, so they're kind of acting out the ritual. So all that stuff about Jon and the Red Wanderer and the thief and the moon maid, that comes in a scene where Jon is walking up to the top of the Fist of the First Men looking for Ghost. And in that scene, we get some really cool Ghost astronomy. He found Ghost atop the hill, as he thought he might. The white wolf never howled, yet something drew him to the heights all the same. And he would squat there on his hindquarters, hot breath rising in a white mist as his red eyes drank the stars. Do you have names for them as well? So we've already seen that Ghost has red star eyes. Now his eyes are drinking in the starlight. And it's funny that Jon asks Ghost if he has his own names for the constellation, because there is a constellation named the Ghost. So if you need any more proof that Ghost is going to end up with starry eyes, meaning being a fire wight, then keep watching. I've got just one more little thing. So as Jon's walking up the hill and thinking about Ygritte and the Red Wanderer and the thief and all that, he mentions a few other Westerosi constellations and their wildling counterparts. And as you can see, the king's crown is called the Cradle up here, the stallion is called the Horned Lord by the wildlings, and Mars is called the thief. So the stallion being the same thing as the Horned Lord, well, this is just an allusion to Odin as a horned god, a horned lord of death and resurrection. And the stallion, obviously, would be Yggdrasil or Sleipnir, Odin's shamanic horses, the ones he rides into the cosmos, up into the starry sky. And George further spells out this idea in the other quote about the Horned Lord, which coincidentally is in a Jon chapter. Jon sat between two merlins with only a scarecrow for company and watched the stallion gallop up the sky. Or was it the Horned Lord? He wondered where Ghost was now. So just as at Drogo's pyre, the stallion is riding up to the sky and up to the stars. You know, that's where the Red Wanderer is, and also Ghost. So yeah, George is seemingly drawing a nice comparison between Drogo's Pyre and Jon's inevitable resurrection fire. Drogo rode his stallion like a horned god up to the Red Wanderer, and Jon similarly is a horned lord who will be reborn through his spirit animal, who's like a magic tree. So yeah, this was a more symbolism-intensive video, guys, but I hope you did enjoy it, and I hope you believe, like I do, that Ghost will, in fact, be fire-wighted. It really would just make a lot of sense of all this hellhound and Cerberus symbolism, and it sure would be a lot less sad. So thanks for watching, everyone. Do check out the Flexi Spot link in the description below. Promo code Lightbringer. Quit the sit, everyone. Now is the time if you want to get a standing desk. And I will see you each and every Sunday with a Starry Wisdom Sunday live stream from this very desk and studio. So